for the next stage, we'll do my family history. Before I do it, I'm just going to show you where I'm sitting. You can see there's my room there. That's where you come in. There's all the pool. I'm in Lavina, north coast of Bali. I can't remember what the date is, something like, it's Monday, December 15th, 16th, 2013, something like that. Anyway, my family. I've just remembered also, on the previous one, Harry's children, Harry and Paddy, Kath's brother, it's Catherine, Margaret and David. They're all named, of course, Vinyl. They don't have a married name, so it's Harry Vinyl, Paddy Vinyl. David Vinyl is still on YouTube, I mean on Facebook all the time, so you can know him. My history and my family. Kath and Ben met at the Lees Cliff during the war. Dad had been put into the army as a result of the war. He'd been put in the artillery, Royal Artillery, and was based at Shorncliffe Camp on the top of Folkestone, shooting the German bombers as they came in to do the Blitz. So he was up there in the Shorncliffe Army Camp. He was a sergeant, and he and his mates, of course, on their nights off, used to trawl round the dance halls of Folkestone, where, of course, my mother prowled at the same time. He would be immaculately dressed, she also immaculately dressed, looking for a way out of her tedious life at Derry and Tom's. Hated being a seamstress, hated being subservient to anybody. In her childhood, as a 5-6-year-old, she'd been sent to stay with Aunt Ada, I think her name was, who was a lady's maid in Earl's Court. Great big house in Earl's Court Square. Later on, my mum and I went there to have a look at it, and she said she hated it from the minute she arrived. She was sent up to be finished off in one of the great houses there. It was a very smart house then, great big story, 4 or 5 story house in Earl's Court. Very smart at the time. The family at that time would have been away. They would have gone off for their summer sojourn somewhere. So the house was empty and just the staff. So the aunt, as I said, was in service, and Kath would be sent up. First thing the aunt would do was remove all of Kath's clothes, as unfashionable, horrible local village clothes as she considered them, and replace them all with London clothes. That didn't go down well with my mum, and she fought and scratched and kicked, and I think she went up there twice, and then they said, please don't send Kathleen up again, she's just unmanageable. So after that she wouldn't go up again. So this is the character of Grandma Kath. So eventually she's out at the Lees Cliff Pavilion, my dad's out at the Lees Cliff Pavilion, and they meet. He thinks she's the most gorgeous thing on the planet. She thinks my meal ticket. As I said in the previous one, she had done some modelling, and for Derry and Tom's, what she also used to do during the busy periods is, because she wasn't very good in her seamstress department, all the girls in there hated her because she was so uppity, she used to be dressed as Miss Violet in Victorian clothes, and there are photos of her all dressed up in great big Victorian crinolines with baskets of violets, which she used to give out outside Derry and Tom's in the High Street, and she would just march up and down looking gorgeous in this Victorian violet crinoline. But that's who she thought she was. And of course, after Gone with the Wind, she just saw herself as Vivian Leigh in the clothes, in the outfit. That was her role in life, to be a Southern Belle princess. Anyway, Dad and her sort of ish got on. He wanted to show that he'd made it. He was an important person. He'd been the youngest manager of a big branch of Sainsbury's. After the war, he went back, and he wanted on his arm the flashiest bit of stuff that was available in Folkestone, and that happened to be my mum. When she took him home to meet Edie and Bertie, they immediately rejected him. He's too old. He was 6 years older. He was born in 1913. She was born in 1918. And in 37, 38, they just said, "I'm sorry, he's too old for you." And looking at him, he's far too flash. He's obviously married. He's got a wife somewhere. No one with his amount of money and his expectations would not have a wife. So they just said no. My mum, as you can imagine, knowing her character, just said, "Stuff you. He is my meal ticket out of here, and I'm taking him." So they were married just before the war. My mum then left her mother's house, as all wives did, apart from Nora, who was still living there. She had a house of her own, but she spent most of her time during the war with her mother at Canterbury Road. And Kath moved into a house in George Gurr Crescent. It's still there. It was a council house. They didn't have any money, so it was a council house that they moved into. And then 5, 6 years later, no children. And it became a great concern to my mum and her family that there must be something wrong with either her or my dad, because they hadn't had any children. So they were considered to be a very suspect couple. Eventually, I think it was after 7 years, Jane was born. And Jane was the absolute apple of my dad's eye. She was stunning looking, intelligent, bright, cheerful, lovely. The baby everybody wanted. 2 years later, Libby. Jane was dark. She was one of the dark ones. When Lib was born, she was a white blonde. So there she was in the pram, 2 years younger than Jane. Jane looking very dark and somber. Lib, white curly hair, beautiful complexion, lovely looking baby, calm, peaceful, placid. Jane certainly wasn't any of those things. So jealousy. Jane had been an only child for 2 years, used to her dad's 100% attention. Suddenly there was this very beautiful child that everybody just smiled at because she was just so pretty. Little white curls. Lib's still got some photos of her in the pram, and you'll see, lovely looking baby. So jealousy set in, and Jane never, ever, ever got over it. And as each of the rest of us was born, she got worse and worse. There's one story that Kath tells where she was sitting there and suddenly she could hear screaming from one of the toilets. And Lib by then must have been about 2. She was probably pregnant with me. And screaming coming from the toilets. So toilet door was locked. Jane was in there with Lib, and there's a pair of scissors. And Kath couldn't get into the toilet, so someone is sent down to Dad's Sainsbury's shop, and the manager is called. "Could Mr. Pick please come up? There's a problem with his wife at home." So he had to run from the shop. Took about 20 minutes to get home. Bashed the door down, and in there was Jane with the scissors, Lib crying her eyes out, and all of Lib's hair all over the floor. Jane had taken the scissors to her and chopped off every bit of hair that she'd got. So that was that story. Then I came along. I was another of these really blonde, very pretty babies, curly white hair. And Anne and Sue and Val would put me into baby competitions. In the summer in places like Folkestone, Kath would go up there with, when they lived there, and Anne and Val would come and collect me, take me down to the Lees Cliff and to the places down there, and keep entering me into baby competitions because I was such a pretty baby. And of course that made Jane even worse. So lived in George Gurr Crescent till I was about 2.5. I can remember living there. I can remember having friends, very young friends with neighbours, and one day running away. I just had enough and ran away. And the whole of the family, there was Bertie, there was Edie, there was Sybil, everybody looking all over Folkestone for me. 2.5, I'd just run off. And eventually they found me and the kid next door hiding in a barrel. And inside the barrel was the remains of tar which they'd used for the roads. So there was myself and this kid from next door covered head to foot in black tar. Anyway, carried on living there. Beck was born, and then eventually Jew was born. My mum hated babies, never wanted one, only wanted to be her and Dad, have all the money that he earned, because he earned very good money, and he wanted it spent on her and clothes and nightclubs and fun and going out and entertainment. And suddenly it was baby after baby after baby. And what we would now say was, of course, she had postnatal depression, very severe postnatal depression, after Lib, after me. When she became pregnant with Beck, I think that's 2 years later. It was sort of 18 months. There's 3 years between Lib and I, and then it's 18 months between the other two. Just devastated, and I am sure did whatever she could to remove the babies, but at that time that was very difficult. We've always said there were probably others that we never knew about, but she just went into depression. Dad by then had 5 children in a small little house in George Gurr, and decided that he just couldn't afford it. So he decided one day that with his experience he would find somewhere a business of his own to develop. So he looked through the papers and saw a business for sale in Devon. He was a master butcher, and it was a butcher shop in Dawlish in Devon. I was 2.5. Jew was, I suppose, about 3 months old. So he and Bertie got into their little Austin 7 that Dad had, little Austin 7. You can imagine, in 1953. And they drove what must have been 4 or 5 hours then to Devon, to this little tiny village, Dawlish, 3,000 people. And there was this shop in the main street called the Strand, and my dad took one look at it and said yes, organised the finance and bought it that day. Came back and said to Kath, I bought a business, we're going to Devon. She had a nervous breakdown, couldn't imagine how she was going to survive without her family, her and 5 kids in this little place she'd never been to, knew nothing about, knew no one, and it was devastating for her. Within a month, my dad had given his notice at Sainsbury's. They packed up the Austin 7 with everything they owned, 5 kids, a canary in a cage hanging on the outside, the boot open full up with luggage, and off we went. We arrived. It was a 3-storey building, a very small shop on the front, butcher's shop. The middle flat, because it was 3 stores, the middle floor was led to, what was her name? Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Williams, her husband, and their son Terry. And they had the whole of the middle floor. We were all up on the top floor, 7 of us. It was 1, 2, 3 bedrooms and a kitchen, living, dining, everything area, which was about 10 by 10 on the top floor, with a small bathroom beside it. Kath's kitchen was a cooker and a sink. In a small part of that room, it was sort of an L shape, and part of that was the kitchen, which was about 3 feet by 3 feet. So no kitchen cupboards, no fitted kitchen, just a cooker, some shelves and a sink. And then this other part of the room where 7 of us sat at a dining table with a long window on one side, no TV, we didn't have TV, 1 armchair, that's all there was room for, 1 armchair for Dad. So that's how 7 of us lived. We never had TV, no telephones, no TV till I suppose I was about 8 or 9. Mrs. Williams below, whose husband worked for the railways, got a TV long before us, and on big occasions, big programs that everybody wanted to watch, she would have dozens of people in from the street. So we would all sit there in rows. Her living room was the size of 2 or 3 of our bedrooms, with 1 long room front to back on one side of the building, and that was her living room. She had much more space than we had. And we would all go down with all the people from down the town and all sit there like a theatre, watching this little 10-inch screen. And that went on for many, many years. We all went as children to the Dawlish Primary School and the Dawlish Junior School. That was about 500-600 yards along the high street in the old part of town. So every morning, Jane, Lib and I, to begin with, would go off to school. We'd be given 3pence, and on the way was a sweet shop, and we would buy a bag of a jamboree bag or some jacks or whatever to go to school with, and our 5 shillings each week for our lunch money for school meals. I went to the junior school, the infant school, which was at the bottom of the hill, and Lib and Jane by then were at the junior school, which was at the top of the hill. Little granite Victorian school. I suppose I had 40 people in my school, and I started off in Mrs. Wright's class. There were 2 classes, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and then I went into Mrs. Cox's class, where I was taught to read, write, joined up writing and all those things. Loved it. I was in school plays, and it was just an idyllic childhood. Opposite the school was a big place called the Manor, which was the town hall, with huge gardens where we as kids just ran wild, 5 of us. All through the summer holidays, we would go down to the beach every day. Kath would come down at lunchtime with peaches and some fruit and some sandwiches, find us. We would normally go onto the local beaches. The tourists, because it was a tourist town, would all go to the right under the railway onto the main beach. We would go to the left onto Coast Guard's beach or along to Corrigan Cove, which the tourists never ever found. And that's where Kath would find us, bring us our lunch, sit with us for half an hour, 45 minutes, and then go home. So we would be out from 9 in the morning until 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night when we'd be called in. If we didn't go down to the beach, we would be going to farms in Dawlish Waters, 2, 3, 4, 5 miles away. And I can remember as a child sitting in cabbage fields when we were tiny, looking up at the cabbages, picking off the caterpillars. But the smell of those cabbages and sitting there with, say, a drink underneath the cabbages in the shade in the summer was just lovely. So that was where I started. Jane went from the junior school, which was 7 to 11, and she passed her 11 plus, and she went to Teignmouth Grammar School. Lib didn't pass the 11 plus, so she, with her friends Denise and lots of the other girls there, went to Dawlish Secondary Modern, which she regretted to this day. Dad by that time had enlarged the butcher's shop into a much larger shop and then into a small mini supermarket. Quite a big supermarket by then. And he'd also built a factory at the rear of the property. The property was very extensive. There was the main house with the shop underneath, built in 1702. Behind that was another house, and then some steps up to a garden, and at the rear was a huge corrugated iron garage. It must have been 100 feet long by 50 feet wide on 2 floors. And in there people stored cars and paid him, to store their items there. He brought down from Sainsbury's Eric Hughes, one of the chaps that he'd worked with to help him with the business after a year or so. And Eric came with his wife Sylvie, who was a dressmaker, a grimy woman, chain smoked day in, day out. Their sewing machines had everything in the house, stank of cigarettes, and their son Tony. And they lived in the house at the back of us. Eventually, Dad demolished the garage and built a factory. He was becoming very successful with packed meats. When you go into a supermarket now, you see the little packs covered in polythene. Well, he was the first one to introduce that to Devon. So he was, as a butcher, he had a person at the back, Crusher, another one who came from Sainsbury's, he employed Crusher, who was at the back, and all he did all day was chop up sides of beef, pork, lamb into packs. These would be packed up. Kath would go down and seal them, and we would go and seal them at night, and then they would be shipped out by Mrs. Kneebone in a van to shops all around the area. Torquay, Slades in Torquay, huge circulation, 20-30 miles all the way around. He supplied everybody with meat, so he was now beginning to do very well. He also had a cold meats counter in the shop, which was run by a very lovely lady called Mrs. Fanconi, and her husband was Swiss, and he was a patisserie chap. So when the factory was built at the back, half of it was put over to meat production and packs, and the other half to patisserie. And he would make apple turnovers and cakes and all sorts of things up there. So as children, it was just a wonderful time, and we had in front of it a chunk of garden, about 100 feet by 30 feet, where we as kids could just go and play. So by the time I was 6, my dad was beginning to make quite a bit of money. Lib failed her 11 plus, so he said he would send her off to be privately educated at one of the local private girls' schools. She said no. She was going to stay with her friends, which she said now she wouldn't have changed her mind, but she does regret. I was then, after the primary school, at 6.5, 7, I didn't go to the junior school. I was then sent to a prep school in Teignmouth called the Beacon. 112 of us were there, and it was a joy. All the local businesses sent their kids there once they started to make money, so it was the place to be. Beck and Jew never went to the infant school. They were put straight into the Notre Dame convent in Teignmouth. Beck was hated there as a wild child. Jew was loved. They thought Jew was the most beautiful child ever, most obedient, did what she was told, thick as 2 bricks, but always did exactly as she was told. Beck never ever did anything that she was told and was an absolute rebel, hating every minute of it. So that's where we are. Money has now arrived. Jane's at the grammar, Lib is with her friends at the secondary modern, and I'm at the Beacon. The 2 girls are at the Notre Dame convent.